Hello everybody and welcome back to another Hearthstone video. So today I want to talk a little bit about deck building. So with all of these new Nax cards coming out, we have a lot more choice as deck builders about how we want to go about building our decks. Even old sort of archetypes that we all know and love, you know, Token Druids, Miracle Rogues, Zoo, all of them, Control Warriors, anything. They all have ways and card lists that we sort of understand, right? We know in general what a Control Warrior is going to have in the deck, and we can play around it, and that makes our plays more informed and more interesting. But in the current meta, it's actually very common for those lists to be sort of similar to what they used to be, but have a bunch of new cards in them as well. And so that messes with our perception of them, which is interesting. But it also makes it interesting for us as deck builders, because we have to figure out how to include some of these new Nax cards into old archetypes, and we also have to figure out how to include these cards into new archetypes. The interesting thing about all of this is that we have a lot more choice than we used to, because these new Nax cards, basically all 30 of them, are actually all viable. They're all very interesting in their own ways, and there isn't really even one that I would say is bad out of hand. They all, at the very worst, are situational. And so when we're talking about deck building, we actually all have a lot more choices to make. So today, I want to talk to you a little bit about how we can go about making our decisions easier, and different ways we can think about our decision-making process to sort of knock down the number of options that we have and see if we can make something more reasonable. So, let's get started. Before we start talking about any method of whittling down the card choice, I want to talk about a concept that a lot of professional players just sort of have inherently, and a lot of good players have inherently, but a lot of newer players don't really understand quite yet, and that is the concept of cards as a resource themselves. Okay? So, think about a deck. You have 30 cards and only 30 cards. And so, in essence, every single card slot is actually very valuable to you. Each slot you fill has to be full of value, because if it isn't, you're essentially wasting a slot. Okay? I have introduced a lot of new players to Hearthstone. Whenever I find out that a new friend of mine is interested in video games, for instance, I always say, hey, you should check out Hearthstone if you haven't already. It's really, really interesting. It's easy to play. It's free. It's cool. And so a lot of them do, and a lot of them try it out and start making their own decks. And what's interesting about that to me is how they go about it. And so almost always what I find is people start using this thing, the Gulcher Footman. Or they start using, for instance, the Frostwolf Grunt. That's another one. And so whenever I ask them about that, I say, well, why do you use these cards? A lot of them will say things like, well, it is a great early game taunt. It stops people from getting to my health. And it allows me to build up a board presence. And those statements aren't actually wrong. These cards, a lot of us think are really bad. They're not actually all that bad in a vacuum. There's nothing actually wrong with the Gulcher Footman. If you look at any other one-drop, the stat total is about the same. In fact, it's better than some. And it has taunt, and the stats are distributed in a way that makes it more effective as a taunt. It's not going to trade up, but a lot of one-drops aren't. Even the Argent Squire, which is, of course, used by everyone. I mean, everybody loves the Argent Squire. The Gulcher Footman has more stats, and it'll actually stop things at the one-drop level, right? Anything with one attack at the one-drop level, this will stop. And so, when it comes to early game tempo, this is actually a better option than a lot of the other one-drops we have. With the Frostwolf Grunt, it's a little bit different, because most two-drops have 5 stats on them. If we look at something like a Fairy Dragon or a Knife Juggler, so it's a little bit behind on stat total, but nonetheless it's a taunt. It has 2 health, so it can trade with most 2-drops, and it does force the enemy to trade, and it loses them some tempo. So, what's wrong with these cards? Why don't people actually use them? Well, it's not actually all that easy to explain if you don't understand the fact that cards are a resource. And so, the biggest issue with including something like a Gulcher Footman isn't the fact that it isn't valuable. In a vacuum, it would be completely fine to include this in a deck. However, you only have 30 card slots. And so by including this, you are preventing yourself from including something else. And so you're preventing yourself from including, say, an Argent Squire. You're only going to have a certain number of slots in the one-drop level, right? Depending on the deck, you have more or less. And so, I mean, if I go to my zoo deck, for instance, I have 6 different cards here, or 3 different types of cards that are 1-drops. And so I have more play for that, to include something like a Gulcher Footman, for instance. But if I go to my token cycle deck, then I only have 2 1-drops. Both of them are Argent Squires, and I only have a couple of small minions. And so, by including a Gulcher Footman, I am actually consciously preventing myself from including something like an Argent Squire, right? And that's the best case. If you want to include it in something like a Ramp Druid or something, I have nothing here that's really low, right? Wild Pyromancers are not an early game card for a Ramp Druid, neither is Thalnos. Both of these things you want at the end of the game rather than at the beginning usually. And so really, I don't have any drops here that I consider early game before the 4 mana level. And so if I were to put in a Gulcher Footman, I'm consciously excluding some better card from being in there. Now, it's really important to note the difference, right? The conclusion is the same either way. The Gulcher Footman is not a card you want to include in a lot of decks. But it's important to understand why we make that distinction. It isn't because the Gulcher Footman is bad. As a card itself, at the 1-drop level, it is valuable, and actually would be effective at the 1-drop level. But it takes up a card slot that could be used by a much more valuable card in that it is more applicable in most of the game, right? A Gulcher Footman is not useful on the 9th turn, for instance, but something like a Wild Pyromancer is. Something like an Argent Squire actually has the potential to be, right? Depending on the type of deck. So it's important to think of universal applicability, but it's also important just to think of it in terms of this card prevents you from putting in some other card, okay? So if we take that concept, I want to apply it to all the new Nax cards, for instance. I want to look at them in terms of what you lose from including them, as opposed to what you gain. Okay? So let's have a look at something like the Nerubian Egg. This guy is used in a lot of decks these days. It's a really, really popular card, and for good reason. It's very valuable. It is a 0-2 to start, so that's bad. But if you are a class that can buff it somehow, which a lot of classes are, you can buff it, trade it into something, and potentially get a minion out of it, and then it will summon a 4/4 for you when it dies. All for 2 mana, originally. That's a really great deal. But I want to talk about why it isn't a great deal, potentially. A lot of decks like Zoo, for instance, and my version lately has included it. I haven't been playing Zoo very much, but nonetheless it's there. By putting this in there, by putting in a 2-drop here, I'm essentially excluding myself from using another 2-drop, right? So in here I have a Fairy Dragon, a Knife Juggler, Direwolf Alpha, and an Amani Berserker. I only have one Amani Berserker because I have an Argent Commander in there instead. I've gone 1-on-1 here. By putting in the Nerubian Eggs, I'm preventing myself from using other 2-drops, right? It's taking up a 2-drop slot for me. And so, let's say, for instance, let's go and find ourselves a 2-drop. So first of all, it's taking up the slot where I could be using another Amani Berserker, but it's also taking up a slot that I could be using an Acidic Swamp Ooze, for instance. And so, let's say for a moment that I switch out the Nerubian Eggs for 2 Acidic Swamp Oozes. What do I gain from that? Well, I actually gain a lot. If you think about it, I lose the potential for a 4/4, and I also lose the potential to be scary against something like an AoE board clear, which for Zoo is fairly important. But if I play this on turn 2 versus playing this on turn 2, it's not going to do any damage. If I can't activate it, and if the enemy doesn't kill it, it's going to sit there and be a 0/2. And every turn that I can't activate it, it is consciously and significantly worse than if I had the Acidic Swamp Ooze out. Because the Acidic Swamp Ooze, the following turn, could then attack the hero's face and do 3 damage. It could trade for a minion and get a valuable trade out of it. It could trade up because its stat distribution is good. It could be buffed just the same as the Nerubian Egg, but instead of, say, if I gave it Defender of Argus, the egg would be 1/3 and might be able to trade for something. The Ooze would be 4/3 and be a huge threat, especially as far as Zoo is concerned. So, by including the egg, we're actually slowing ourselves down a little bit, right? We're actually preventing ourselves from having something that could trade up, and we're preventing ourselves from having something that is an early tempo move. By playing the egg, we're essentially being more reactionary, and we're waiting for the enemy to do something for us. So, that isn't a bad thing. Having the egg in Zoo, I think, is actually quite strong. And it's important to recognize that it has its value. But it's also very much more important to recognize that it's also preventing you from doing other stuff. So even if you ultimately make the choice to include the Nerubian Egg, you have to consciously be aware that it's preventing you from adding something like a 3/2 minion for 2 mana. It's preventing a stronger tempo move. If we're talking about deck building in general, what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the egg not for what it brings to the table, but for what it takes away from the table. Okay? So what do you stand to lose from including it rather than what you gain? Because it's fairly obvious to look at something for what you gain, and a lot of people talk about it as far as, I'm going to include fairy dragons because they're great against spells and they're powerful as a 2-drop. They don't look at it and say, but I could be having something else here. I could be having an acidic swamp ooze to fight back against warriors and hunters and rogues, or something to that effect, right? If you look at cards negatively, it can give you another perspective. I'm going to go with another example here as well. So as soon as I find him, here we go. The Unstable Ghoul came out this week in the Plague Quarter, and everybody likes the card. I think it's a really interesting card, especially against aggro. It does 1 damage to all minions when it dies, and it's a 1/3 taunt that you can play very early in the game. So it's very good for things like killing zoo decks, and just preventing aggressive decks from really getting a foothold on the board. And so a lot of people are interested in having this in their decks. A lot of control warriors are interested in having this in their decks. But for all of its benefits, I want to propose to you that if you look at this negatively, you might have second thoughts. So for instance, it's really cool because it deals damage to all of the enemy's minions and yours, and it prevents them from getting a foothold on the board early on. What if you included a Wild Pyromancer instead? It's exactly the same thing, right? If we go back to a deck of mine, let's say a Ramp Druid. So I have Wild Pyromancers in here. Mostly my reason for doing that is for dealing with aggro cards. So what if I included a Ghoul in here instead? Is that better? Well, the interesting thing is, if you include the Ghoul, the enemy's forced to trade. It's like an abomination, and therefore they are forced to actually take that damage. The Wild Pyromancer might not actually give them damage. They could kill it for free, essentially. However, it also has 3 attack. And so it can trade up. If you're not fighting something that's aggressive, if you're fighting a handlock, for instance, this is going to be useless, the Unstable Ghoul. But the Wild Pyro could actually trade up into things, and that's interesting. That's useful. If you're playing a Control Warrior, this is the sort of thing that can fight back against like an Armor Smith or an Acolyte of Pain much better than something like an Unstable Ghoul, which will just give them a lot of cards and will give them a lot of armor. So, Wild Pyromancers have a lot of merit to them and are interesting in their own way, and for everybody who's thinking about including an Unstable Ghoul, it's important to think that when you do that, you're actually losing a lot of early game attack. Once again, you have a 2-mana creature and you only have 1 attack on it. And so what you sacrifice by including something that's relatively good against aggro, and something that's sort of a guarantee of doing well against aggro, is actually a lot of applicability to other circumstances. And so in control matchups or other mid-range matchups, tempo matchups, this card is the worst card by far. And so having something like a Wild Pyro is more universally applicable, and it's more interesting that way. So it looks like a really great card in a void. But if you think about what things you're not going to include because you're including this, because you wouldn't have a Wild Pyromancer and an Unstable Ghoul, there's no reason for that. So if you look at things that you wouldn't include as a result of this card, you might have second thoughts. Not to say that either one is better, but each one is situational, and it's important to consider them in that light. Now, doing this sort of thing won't just give you second thoughts about a card. It can actually help to really prove to you how great a card actually is. And so another card that came out this week from the Plague Quarter is the oh-so-charming Sludge Belcher. And so this card is a 5-mana 3/5 that's a taunt, and its death rattle is to summon what essentially is a Goldshire Footman. Okay? It's a 1/2 taunt, so it's actually a really interesting card. A lot of people like it, a lot of people don't think it's all that good. It's really a matter of opinion, but I would argue it's actually excellent. And you can tell how excellent it is by thinking about how you would play it. So let's say in this deck, for instance, I am interested in including a Sludge Belcher into this deck. And perhaps I would put it in instead of Sunwalkers, instead of Druids of Claw, or maybe even instead of a Chillwind Yeti. These are all very valuable cards, of course, and it makes it a difficult case to make. But let's say I was interested in including it instead of, say, a a Fen Creeper. It's a better option for 5-mana taunt, if I'm looking at the 5-mana taunt area. And I mean, maybe the Ramp Druid's a bad choice, because Druids have an excellent 5-drop taunt in the Druid of the Claw. Let's say I'm looking at a Control Paladin. Okay, so in the 5-mana slot, let's say I want to be a little bit more taunty, and I'm not a big fan of the Azure Drake. Well, why don't we look at what I can do? I can put in the Fen Creeper, which is a 3/6 for 5. That's not so bad. I can put in Sen'jin Shieldmasters, which are 3/5 for 4, so it's basically the exact same as a Sludge Belcher, but it's 1 mana cheaper. It just doesn't have the Death Rattle. I could put in a Mogashan Warden, which is not very good for trading up, but it has a lot of taunt. I have a lot of different options for this sort of level. Abomination is another one, for instance. But if you think about it, the Sludge Belcher is actually, in a way, better than all of those cards. It is a 3/5 for 5, and so the taunt is strong, it's reasonable, but if you actually kill this card, you still have a taunt there. And no other card has that. Unless you silence the Sludge Belcher, no matter what removal you use, it's going to be a 2-for-1 card. You're going to have to deal with the second thing that it spawns. Even if it's not very good, it's a Goldshire Footman, essentially. But I said earlier, if you'll recall, Goldshire Footman is not a terrible card in a Void. The thing that makes it awful is that it's taking up a card slot. This Goldshire Footman does not take up a card slot. And so the opponent has to waste 2 cards at least to get rid of it if they're not going to silence it. And it will probably trade well, and it will probably more effectively protect you as a taunt minion than, say, a Fen Creeper or a Sen'jin Shieldmaster would. And so on those levels, it actually makes the Sludge Belcher look like a really powerful card. And so when you include it in your deck, you think about what things you wouldn't include as a result. And in this case, I would probably not include the Azure Drakes. I lose spell damage and I lose card draw, but spell damage isn't especially important in a deck like a Control Paladin, and card draw, I have a lot of other means by doing that, especially when we think about Lay on Hands, for instance. So card draw is not really a problem, particularly when I'm playing slow. So when you compare it, it actually isn't that much of a sacrifice. Now, I mean, I'm not advocating to put Sludge Belchers into Control Paladins. I'm not sure that would be a good trade in general, because the deck just doesn't need it. But you see the sort of comparison I'm trying to do. When you look at cards for what they don't bring, what you sacrifice, as opposed to what they do bring, you have a clearer understanding of why and how they're useful. Okay? So that's basically it. When we're talking about negative comparison, that's basically what I mean. And so when you're building your decks and when you're thinking about what cards to include in your new Naxx-oriented decks, pay attention not just to how valuable the new card is, because frankly, a lot of the new cards are very valuable, but pay attention to what it is that you're sacrificing in order to put into the deck, right? So another good example is when you're looking at any kind of a hunter deck, and you're tempted to put in something like the Haunted Creeper because it's a good beast, it's great in hunter decks. What is it that you're sacrificing by putting it in? And what could you put in instead of it? And see whether or not it's a useful trade, whether or not it's a valuable trade. So thanks so much for watching, guys. If you have any questions about this, feel free to ask here or anywhere really that you can get a hold of me. On my Twitter, you can tweet at me. It's at DreadmakerHS. And otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.